Ding.
And welcome everyone back to Brain Swap for the evening, where today we'll be talking about long-running anime series.
How long are we talking about?
Very long. So there's anime series that go for 13, 26, even 50 episodes. But here we're talking about those shows that go for longer than that, into the hundreds of episodes.
Whoa.
So examples of that would include, say, Naruto or Bleach or One Piece or Dragon Ball Z, those kinds of shows.
Would those be considered good?
Well, it depends on how you define good. Good's always a very subjective term. But the question is, if you got a long-running series, what elements of that concept make that long-running series work well?
Well, I suppose you have to have some degree of success in order just to get a long-running series.
Sure.
It's got to be good to some degree, but not every episode is going to be fantastic. As just the sheer volume of number of episodes, there are bound to be some that are less fantastic than the peak ones. So
I guess the larger question would be, we've seen some shows, some long-running shows, go for a very long time, and some of them kind of flame out and die. We've seen various things happen to these various long-running series. So what makes the long-running ones, and I guess we'll use length of time running as a proxy for good. What makes a show run longer? What makes it survive for hundreds and hundreds of episodes?
Well, I'd hate to go right for the money trail, but that always helps. Having funding definitely makes it. Having merchandise supports it.
Well, sure.
And with support, that creates the vehicle for it. But does that make a good story?
Well, and I think what I mean by this is not so much how much money does it have, but what elements of the show are causing people to come back to it and watch it.
So within a storyline, say plot or characters,
whatever,
having a good story arc that...
Well, whatever's in there.
I think having a variety, not getting too pigeonholed into just one area. Yes, it's good to have action, but if it's all action all the time, eventually it gets into the battle of the day.
I mean, variety of genre, you mean?
Even within a genre, you can have a battling, but if you have elements of romance, elements of humor, elements of mystery, all those little things can be woven in while still staying true to the genre, and they add enough flavor and spice into the story to keep viewers entertained, especially those who are on the peripheral edge of the genre. Say somebody's diehard action, they're going to watch it regardless. But if somebody's okay, I like action, but I also like some comedy, it's going to be harder for them to weather the storms of just action, where if there's some elements of comedy, elements of romance, elements of mystery, as I said, and suspense is always good. Suspense draws your viewer to the next episode, and that can be done well, or it can be done in a way where it fatigues the viewer. And I think having a good sense of what amount of suspense is good really is useful in keeping a series going, where the fans will continue to watch and keep an interest. So let's say you have the vehicle, the finances, having a good story with suspense to draw the viewer into the next episode will keep that cycle going. And so I'd have to say some episodes seem to have the same suspense over and over again to the point where it fatigues the viewers. And they get to an area where they don't need to see it. They've already seen it again, and they know that's going to happen next week.
What do you mean by suspense in that sense?
Well, if you drag on an epic battle between two characters, but there's never any hope for resolution, then there's the viewer is left going, okay, I know they're not going to battle it this week. I know they're not going to resolve it this week. I know there's not going to be any new fight scene that I haven't already seen some variation of. What's in it for me to keep me excited and entertained about this story?
Yeah.
And having really good choreographed fight scenes can go really far. Having other characters and elements enter into the fight scene, for example. But this is just one genre. I mean, the same could be said about romances. If the guy-girl unrequited love story goes on, and there's never a hope for them getting together, then a person will eventually get fatigued of that kind of scenario, and they need something to change it up a little bit.
So that's to be some forward momentum on the story, the plot.
Exactly.
Okay, gotcha.
And being able to carry that over from episode to episode, it doesn't need to be the same suspense that carries them over every episode. It could be the suspense of the logistics or politics of a storyline carrying over 1 week, and the fight and tension between two particular characters, or an unresolved mystery, or something different each week.
So let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. The Frieza battle from Dragon Ball Z would be the best example of this.
That's almost the touchstone example of it.
Yeah.
I'd venture into the area of saying that sometimes shows will do recap episodes.
Sure.
To the point where they don't need to recap as much as they do.
Right. Yes. And obviously the recap episodes are usually there because they've gone over budget or under budget, or rather they're having issues finishing the next episode, so they have to throw up a recap episode just to have time to get back up to speed, which is not a good sign, and it's usually a signal that folks are having trouble managing the production of the show. It's tough to actually be able to keep it running. It's certainly a bad sign when you're in the middle of a long running show or a long running conflict, and you have to do a recap episode, because that means you can't even manage that one conflict within it. Definitely a bad sign.
I kind of feel that recap episodes are a symptom of an arc gone on too long, or at least in a direction that it needs to change.
So what are some of those other sort of larger things about a long-running series that make it work? I was thinking about this recently, looking at Naruto, and I realized one of the things that people seem to respond to with that show is the breadth of characters. The fact that you have a variety of very strong characters, and I mean strong in the sense of being both vibrant and distinct, while also having a lot of momentum and a lot of agency within their own stories. So you have all these characters who all jump in and have their own things they're trying to accomplish. I think that makes the show interesting, because you get to see how different characters are interacting with each other, and you can kind of swap characters in and out as those conflicts get stale. You can defeat somebody, or somebody can decide not to fight anymore or get injured or whatever, and they can leave, and you can introduce somebody else that does something different. One of the interesting things that Kishimoto did on Naruto is he said he wanted to kind of break with shonen stereotypes and make every character really, really good at one thing and pretty poor at everything else. In most shonen series, characters are trying to be better overall. They're trying to be good fighters, or what have you, better fighters. And they'll specialize, certainly, and they'll have certain techniques and certain things they do very well. But they're usually good, all-round fighters. Whereas in Naruto, you get much more expertise and specialty in those things. And as a result, each of those conflicts and each of those encounters becomes very unique, because you have one unique thing against one unique thing, and you see how those play out over the course of a battle. And I think it's a very effective way of keeping things going. Now, to your point, I think that can also create its own sort of sense of fatigue, because every battle is some new, two different things getting thrown at each other. That pattern becomes kind of obvious after a certain length of time. So You saw that in Naruto, where you have the championship, the arena combat, which worked very well for a while, but then became this pattern of, okay, these two people fight, these two people fight, these two people fight, and these two people fight, and then you need to change things up at some point.
Well, I really think you hit the nail on the head with characters, because without good characters and diversity of characters, a show is going to play out everything. But even in a long-running show, if you have both of those, the chances are you're going to play out certain things.
Sure.
You think of The Simpsons, what haven't they done? I mean, it's just so long. There's so much. But the diversity and depth of the characters, I think, is spot on, because if you have a variety, you can sub in and sub out. You can add in elements as the character develops depth, their motivations, their feelings, their thoughts, their goals, their loves, their their complications. And it seems that all the great authors, when they're designing characters, will have some major character flaw that no matter how good or bad the character is, they have some quality,
often multiple,
multiple, that's opposite of the rest of their character makeup. So you can never get the perfect hero who's absolutely perfect. It would be boring anyways, and harder for the audience to identify, where if there's a character flaw, it makes the character more identifiable and more interesting. Same with the villains. The villains have to have some element of they're not just villain to be villain. They have some backstory that they were hurt, or there's some motivating drive that otherwise it's just it's not as exciting without some sort of complication that causes this. You begin to wonder as you're watching the character, what's the character's motivation? Why do they really want to take over the world? Were they
And this brings up an important dichotomy. We've been talking about shonen series, and we should mention that there are more than just shonen series that go on for hundreds of episodes. There are lots of kids shows out there too. Look at Doraemon and Crayon Shin-chan and Detective Conan. These shows that have hundreds and hundreds of episodes. In the case of Zaisan, thousands. They're up to, I think, 8,000 episodes now.
8,000 episodes.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Pretty crazy.
If you watch one every day, you'd go for years and not
decades, probably. I don't know. So the thing about those shows, though, is they're episodic, right? So Detective Conan generally doesn't have 20 episode long story arcs, and that introduces its own level of complication, because you're having to tell a new story every time. You're not just telling the next paragraph in this long-running novel of a story. So
yeah, if you have complete closure at the end of every episode, that in itself can become not as exciting as a viewer after you've seen enough episodes of something that always has closure. Once you get into it, you almost can get up and walk away, because character A and character B have their differences. They're going to resolve it at the end. And for me, some series, going away from anime for a second, Stargate kind of got that way in its original run, because yes, it was exciting, but I knew a lot of it was going to be wrapped up and not carried over. And those episodes were not as exciting as when issues were unresolved, because life is never all clean cut and dry. There's always some lack of closure, some problem that's carried over into and keeps on going and may go for a long time or never get resolved. And so those always are exciting, because you don't know, will it get resolved? Won't it? Is there going to be? And so, but then if we're talking about closure of an episode that's a completely contained story, like Mushishi, for the most part, were self-contained stories, and you could watch one episode and for the most part watch them out of sequence and still enjoy them, where some shows you kind of have to go in sequence to keep that storyline going. So
definitely. And Liquidus brings up an interesting example of Pokemon, where Pokemon actually follows an interesting sort of middle ground between those two, where a lot of episodes of Pokemon you can watch, self-contained. It's not like, Ash suddenly dies in one episode. That said, they do change up Pokemon, right? So a Pokemon series will come to an end, and then they'll do Pokemon XY or whatever, and then they'll do different takes on Pokemon within the anime series. New cast members come and go, and that is one of the ways that I think they managed to keep that fresh, is that they have that more kid-oriented thing where kids aren't necessarily going to be paying attention to what happened 50 episodes ago.
Yeah, they may not have been alive.
Right, exactly. But that said, you can have things change and evolve when you realize you kind of told as many stories as you can with this set of characters. Now, Fisher and Master Chief Snake bring up in the chat room as well, one of the advantages of filler episodes, going back to that point, is that filler episodes are only there for broadcast, if you will. Often for the DVD release, those get relegated to bonus features or otherwise pushed away. And that's one way of saying, well, yeah, we had to do a filler episode, but you never have to watch it again if you don't have to, right? And that is helpful.
Watching that can be really annoying. I
totally.
just watched that. Why are you telling me again?
Now, the other side of that coin is that I know Gundam had a Gundam Seed. What they would do not full filler episodes. So they would spend, say, half the episode on recap, and then the other half of the episode would be new material. So you couldn't just move it. Yeah. Right. Which, on the one hand, I liked that while I was watching it in broadcast, because I knew they weren't going to spend, I wasn't going to go an entire week with nothing new.
That's good.
You have something in
for
there.
Broadcast, it completely makes sense to get viewers back on board. For DVD release, that's a little trickier. Now, that being said, a long-running series may have different storylines within its franchise.
Sure.
The Tenchi universe has several different things. If a person hasn't followed one of these different series within that franchise, having a recap of that would be really useful.
Sure.
Especially if characters are building on something or working off of a framework that was already existing somewhere else.
And that is the other advantage of filler episodes, is that if it's been 50 episodes and you have no idea what's going on, getting a filler to sort of catch you up can be handy. We tend to forget that we're all kind of crazy otaku, and so we start from episode 1 and watch them all the way through.
Isn't that the way everybody does it?
Exactly. So it can be a little different. But getting back to the sort of higher level topic here, what makes for a good long running anime series? And Liquidus points out the Pokemon does tend to follow kind of the different games as they come out. So Ash moves to a new region, and that's kind of like a new game. And so you have that kind of approach where you shake things up a bit. But I think another important element there too is the kind of story you're telling. So you look at, for example, Dragon Ball Z. One of the issues Dragon Ball Z had is that it was, the story was simply somebody's trying to destroy the world or the galaxy or the universe, and Goku and friends have to stop him or her or it, right? That was the plot. There really wasn't anything bigger going on in those stories in general. Contrast with, say, Dragon Ball, the original series where Goku had his own adventures and he was off trying to collect things. Dragon Ball Z would occasionally bring back in the Dragon Balls and trying to find them and so forth, but it very quickly devolved into this very simple fight. And as a result, it was harder to structure new interesting things in the story. With shows like Naruto or One Piece, for example, you have more ongoing storylines the characters are trying to accomplish. Characters are trying to get stronger. They're trying to defeat bad guys in their area. Adding a more complex, overarching story arc, I think, can make a show more interesting compared to shows with a much more simple concept. Mushishi being a good example, where Mushishi has a fundamentally simple concept, which makes for those individual episodes really compelling. You don't want anything really weird and complex going on there, because that just kind of gets in the way of that jewel of a story in each episode. So I think you have to have something bigger going on to make a long running series kind of work really well.
Well, how about settings?
Yes.
Do settings
That's an interesting
come
question.
into play, or?
Well, certainly for shonen series, we see a common pattern of a fantastical world of some kind. Fairy Tale, Naruto, One Piece, Dragon Ball Z. None of them are the real world. None of them are a particularly, I want to say, intricate or shall we say, carefully constructed world. And I mean no disrespect, but Naruto is very much a bunch of different things all thrown together, right? You have ninja with throwing stars and combat boots and bowls of ramen, and that's all meant to be there. And again, nothing against it. It's just it's not like Dune or Star Trek or Star Wars. We have these very specific parameters.
You had to develop the whole universe for them to be in before you got that.
So so you have this ability to have a relatively elastic fantasy world, if you will, that thus makes it easier for folks to get into, right? I don't have to understand that they're lithium crystals to understand how the Enterprise goes. I don't have to understand warp speed. I just know there are ninjas.
They're ninjas.
And they do ninja stuff. And so I can kind of jump in, and then all the details of that setting, the detail of the worlds and different clans and villages and so forth, all that I can kind of absorb as time goes on. Now, good.
How about location, though?
Location in what sense? Do you mean like specific?
Let's say you have a story with a world. How much variation within that? I mean, if you had it all within the same room, it probably wouldn't be too long a running series. Where something that spreads across a universe or across several different worlds or different realities or different villages, different sort of the geographic layout within the mind of the imagination of the viewer of where this place is.
It's an interesting point, because you look at, say, One Piece, where they're definitely traveling all across their world. It's a very big world they're traveling through. And that's more of an exploratory sort of a show. But contrast with, say, Naruto, where you start very much with these ninja in this village, and then you kind of expand slowly from there, and you see other ninja from nearby villages. And then kind of the story gets larger and larger, but Naruto and Sasuke and Sakura are not jumping all over the world very quickly. They're not traveling to the end of the seas. And
yet it stays a long-running series.
Exactly.
That's successful.
Right. And I think, to your point, it's saying, we're not going to stay in this village forever. We can expand from there as the story needs to, and we will need to. It's not just going to be this little self-contained thing. And you see that again, Pokemon, all the others. I think definitely there's that idea that you have to, eventually move on and move out. I would argue that was one of Bleach's problems, which is that they created this relatively static set of locations and static set of characters who are, in different places, but it didn't have that sense of sort of globe trotting that you get from other shows. And so it was more kind of like a political thriller where, you have different people in different places, but it's basically all their drawing rooms, and it's all variations of, you're coming over to my house and I'm finding you there, and then I'm going there and I'm finding you there. But there's just not that sense of scale that you get in a One Piece or some of these other shows.
Now, I know that audience comes into play, a story targeted to a particular audience that also has a factor. What about character death? The passing on of characters. Now with younger kids shows, there's always the miraculous we came back, oh, we weren't really dead, or
Pokemon,
I was stunned, or amnesia. But with some
I fell off a cliff and
disappeared. Oh, I didn't die, I landed on a log, floated downstream, spent all this time getting back. What would you say to that in respect to long-running series and success?
That's a good point. I think you're absolutely right that introducing death definitely adds something very important to a show, not just because it's death, but because it changes the direction of the show. You know that you can't come back to that character. So especially if a series is willing to commit to that death, right? And some franchises don't do that very well, but it does allow you to say, okay, moving forward, we're gonna have to deal with this event. There's no going back. Master Chief Snake mentions Gundam. And the Gundam franchise, which is an interesting sort of twist on this, in that it's not one long running story, but it's many individual 50-episode stories, more or less 50, going on for decades. So you have these sort of little pieces going on there. So it is sort of a variation on this theme. And Gundam's a good example where in some shows there's definitely death. There's a lot of death. There's weekly death. And in others, characters seem to die, but then they come back. And there's very little of that sort of permanent death. And I think a lot of that depends on just what you want to do with the show. But I think certainly adding death, even if it's not of a major character, but of a significant character, can push the show in important ways. We've seen that in Naruto, we've seen it in other shows, where it helps to push the story forward. And I think similarly, you have to think about adding new characters. Bringing in new characters is certainly important, but also something to be handled very carefully. You don't want to introduce new characters that suddenly overshadow the old characters, or otherwise break up the way they work in a way that makes the show less fun. Right? If you introduce a character who makes Goku suddenly completely weak and powerless, and he can't do anything for the next 100 episodes.
Oh, wow. You've changed the whole...
thing. Now, Dragon Ball Z did kind of do that in a way, in that Goku would go off and other folks would kind of try to fight the person, or other things would happen, and eventually Goku would come back. But it's a frustrating thing for fans when they're there to watch Goku fight. Right? So you got to handle that very, very carefully. And Master Chief Snake also brings up Digimon, another good example. Same kind of idea, where you have these sort of self-contained little stories that then kind of move the story on. So it is an interesting sort of way of doing things.
So being able to gradually weave in and weave out characters in the entire storyline is lends to its longevity.
Definitely. And also too, Sean Byers was here in the chat room a little while ago. Hey, Sean. And he mentioned swag.
Swag's always good,
which is something you brought up, and I think that's an important point, in the sense that the show does have to merchandise these characters, if you will, right? So all this material must at some point serve the merchandise engine. So finding ways of doing that in a way that can serve that merchandise, I think, is very important.
And people who get the merchandise are doing advertising for the show inadvertently, whether they like it or not. If they have it and they're buying it, or bringing it, or displaying it, or enjoying it in one way or another. What is that character keychain on your cell phone? Oh, that's from this show.
What is that? Figurine. Exactly. You see that in Naruto with headbands, with weapons, with all that stuff, where you like that particular team or that particular group. Well, they're going to have something specific that you can then go out and buy and have fun with.
Add on cosplay, and next thing you know.
Right. Well, and the other thing we're seeing now too is, and this is something else to get into, the idea of spin-offs.
Ooh.
You look at what happened with Naruto, where they said, okay, at some point we have to end this story. So they said, okay, we're going to end this story, and then we're going to jump forward 10 years. And now we're going to have a whole new set of characters. We're going to have, all their kids. We're going to have their story. Exactly. And so this idea that you can tell these spin-off side stories, or even sequel stories, that include new characters and old characters.
That's one thing that's really nice about anime is it's developing over time, and there is, to some degree, a feedback loop with the production and the story writers.
Sure.
And if a character gets popular enough, a spin-off is a potential market that they might follow through with.
Now, in anime, that happens less often, because since it is an ongoing story that's generally being written, if you will, by usually the original publisher, who's kind of driving that, they can go back and say, okay, this character's popular. Guess who shows up next episode? We're gonna have them in the show a lot more often. Uchiha in Naruto is a good example of that, where folks love that villain, so he just showed up more and more. More often we see it in that, but certainly you do see these side characters, kind of get more material for them.
Well, I'm curious now, as you mentioned that, following a manga that's already been released versus branching off on their own storyline, which has a tendency to really lend its
That's a very good question.
Support to a longer running series.
I think it definitely depends. You look at, and there's certainly been advantages and disadvantages. So let's look at some of the big shonen series over time. So Dragon Ball Z, from what I understand, had the advantage that it could follow the manga fairly closely for a while. And then it ended up more or less expanding some of those stories and kind of spending a long time on one fight that was taking a certain amount of time in the manga. So it kind of prolonged the material for the anime. Rurouni Kenshin, in contrast, adapted the manga for the first 2 seasons, and the 3rd season was more or less completely filler. So they just went off in their own direction and did season 3. With Pokemon, that's original, so that there's no manga they're adapting for that. They kind of do their own thing. You look at Naruto, and well, you have the whole problem with Shippuden, where Naruto said, "Okay, we're going to move off." And Naruto, the next generation. There we go. The continuing voyages. So Naruto had this big problem where they would spend 50 episodes on filler, just where nothing happened, where it would just kind of sit there and spin its wheels for long amounts of time, until there was enough material to start readapting again. So that can be more of an issue because you have that question: do you try to keep pace with the manga when you're not going to be able to do that? You're going to have to find some way of kind of filling in the gaps, or do you more or less take a break from the manga and then come back when you're able to kind of fill it back in? And I'm trying to think of a good example of a shonen series recently that did that, and it's not coming to my mind. But we are seeing that somewhat more often, where you'll get a season or 2 of something, and then they'll just stop and they'll come back later once there's more material.
So how often is it that an anime comes first and then the manga?
Pretty rare, relatively speaking. About, I think it's 80% of anime is an adaptation of something. So I think it's about 15% of anime right now is original, about 5% are short films, and then the other 80% are manga, light novel, video game, etc. adaptations. And I think about 30% of the total are manga adaptations, something along those lines.
Light novels. So potentially, if a series is doing well, it would have all 3 and be able to interchange back and forth to keep
potentially, yeah, but that's pretty hard.
Has it ever been done that way? Or?
I can't think of an example. There probably are. The thing is, usually the anime is more or less an ad for the original work, right? The reason they're making the anime is because there's a successful manga and they want to sell more copies of that manga and make a big franchise. So, speaking very, very simply, the purpose of the Naruto anime is to sell more copies of the Naruto manga, which it's done a very good job of doing. So that means that there has to be something they're pushing. Pokemon is selling the video games. There is certainly anime that's original, but that's more of a risk, and it's harder to get that going. Now, Precure is a good example of that. So the Magical Girl series Precure is original. It is an ongoing series in the sense that so every season introduces new characters, but conceptually they're all in the same world. They're just in different sort of locations doing their own thing. So in the movies, for example, they all see each other. And I may be incorrect on that. I think they're all. I know in the movies they all fight together. But I think they're not like rebooting every single season. So that is one of those examples where, because Magical Girl has for lack of a better word, a more robust and specific merchandising structure, where girls buy a larger variety of stuff, right? They won't just buy a figurine, they'll buy the compact, and they'll buy the wand, and they'll buy all these various things. It's a little easier for them to do that, and there's a longer tradition of them doing in shoujo. But in shonen, there's usually something they're adapting.
Well, that makes me wonder.
Gundam's different, yeah.
So it seems that games would help promote longevity, because you can always do another game afterwards with the characters and expand that. What about things like music, where we can see people doing karaoke or a great soundtrack by famous artists, opening and closing sequences? Would that lend to a longer series, or is it making sort of such a large ripple that it's a premature ending for the series?
Yeah, I don't see that happening much. I don't see like album sales having a huge impact on the show itself. It's certainly selling. It's certainly a good thing, but it's not it doesn't feed back into the show itself much to improve its popularity.
Yeah, I can't think of any really long running series that have soundtracks that have done super fantastic. I've seen some that have franchises. Ghost in the Shell has some great sound, and of course Bebop. But Bebop was, and it ran its course and it was over. So it seems that having something that's really powerful on the music market doesn't necessarily translate into a longer running series.
Now, Jess brings up a great question here about Sailor Moon, pointing out that this is similar to how Sailor Moon worked in the 90s. And that's an unusual case, because with Sailor Moon, there was originally a manga called Sailor V, which the mangaka was drawing. She then was actually contacted by the anime staff, and they said, we want to do an anime of this, but we have our own ideas. We want to move it in this different direction of having a team and all this various stuff. And they more or less pitched the basics of Sailor Moon to her, and she said that's a good idea. And so she went back and kind of repitched and kind of rebooted the series as Sailor Moon. As a result, there was a manga and an anime series. In a sense, the anime came first because it was that was conceived first. But then you had an anime and a manga essentially supporting each other and telling different stories. So the mangaka wasn't necessarily following the anime series, which is one of the reasons why Sailor Moon Crystal is the opportunity to go back and kind of tell the manga story more directly. Because the anime series was like, well, it's awesome that she's doing that. We're kind of talking back and forth, but
overlapping, but
very much overlapping, right?
Not following the same stories. That's double enjoyment, because then you can watch the anime and read, and you're not saying, oh, this didn't follow that, or that didn't follow this.
Exactly. They kind of weren't meant to, in a sense. So, and obviously they were, it's not like they were completely different stories. But.
Well, now, Sailor V, was that released anywhere?
Oh, yes. There were, I think, 2 volumes of Sailor V. They're available in English. They were released a couple of years ago over here in America. I have volume 1, actually, and I think volume 2.
Yeah, I thought I'd seen it somewhere. Now, would that be considered part of the series? Since
technically, yes, because Sailor V is essentially a prequel to Sailor Moon. And indeed, in the Sailor Moon anime series, there are references to the original Sailor V, or at least in the manga. So, explanation. Sailor V, I believe, transforms using a video game of some kind, like an arcade game, and that arcade game shows up in Sailor Moon, and Sailor Moon actually says, I wish I was like Sailor V someday, and then she actually becomes Sailor Moon. So there are these kind of references back to Sailor V being out there.
Great.
And Sailor Moon says, I've heard of this character called Sailor V. That's kind of cool. It's a really neat plot device. In fact, if you read Sailor V, one of the neat things is that Naoko Takeuchi, the mangaka, she was obviously talking with them, and then they decided to wrap up Sailor V. Near the end of Sailor V, she's kind of winning her battles. Everything's great. She's running down the street, and she's talking about how great the future is going to be. And Serena from Sailor Moon walks past her. And they have no idea who each other are, but you realize, the mantle's about to be passed on.
The magic bit.
Was really neat little twist in there.
Yeah. Referencing other things outside of the own little series or franchise, even referencing other anime.
Oh yeah,
referencing, as Samuel said, what about references even to Western work or novels or novelists, or even things outside of a common sci-fi that everybody's familiar with.
Yeah, I don't see that much in these longer running anime series. Partly because, again, they're trying to keep their own story going. So the more they pull in from other worlds, the more they have to support, in a sense, which kind of complicates the thing.
I would suppose that also the references to certain things that are popular at the time would be more problematic because they'd become dated, where something to classical literature would probably be less dated because it's already dated.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so you want to avoid that, especially for these long-running series, and particularly, well, more in the past, because there was more that sense that you were going to potentially distribute it overseas. And now that distribution happens so quickly, it's less of a big deal. But you kind of don't want to do that. And then also, I think anime staff are much savvier these days about throwing in references to current Japanese pop culture. So you see less of these jokes about a current pop singer in Japan, for example, that folks just aren't going to know outside, unless it's like some wacky comedy where, well, they're going to change all the jokes anyway because they're not going to make sense. But it's just not that great.
I heard Fooly Cooley's reference to, what was it, Crystal Pepsi?
Oh, yeah.
That was actually something different originally, but they had to make it for the American market so that it would be understandable.
Exactly.
And I'm sure there's all sorts of other things in there that somebody could probably do a dissertation on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's complicated because you have to actually, you have to look at the cultural reference and say, does anyone in the target area recognize what that is? If not, the point is for there to be a joke, right? The point is for it to be funny. The point is not to reference
that specific thing.
If
you can do both, great.
But,
when you have to choose between the two.
Yeah. Generally speaking, the original joke author isn't trying to preserve Japanese culture with that joke, right? It's just a joke about a soda or a food or whatever. Anyway.
This is something that we see come into a lot of fiction is Nazism. We have sort of a feel sometimes when there's a regime that has sort of this strict uniformed, we're going to take over, I think of Conqueror of Shambhala, Full Metal Alchemist, the enemy. On an individual basis, some of the people are okay, but the leaders are whacked out, going in certain specific directions that are obviously not for. Do you see those kind of references?
I see them as less often about Nazism and more about sort of imperialism and dictatorship in general. I mean, let's not forget that Japan had a period of strong imperialism and militarism in the early 20th century. So I think more often they're referencing that period in their own culture, and also other periods in Asian culture in general, where you had one person who kind of stepped in and took over, and things got very scary for a while. Mao. So these things happen. Let's not forget, they were allies. Japan doesn't see World War II Germany in the same demonic way that pop culture in, say, America or Britain does. Not okay.
To some degree, it has to be clear, taken in context.
They're not saying Nazism's awesome.
However, their references to it are with a different background. They're coming to it with this was an.
So, good example in there would be shows like Girls in Panzer, where cute girls in tanks, and also Hitalia, where you have characters wearing Nazi uniforms or wearing German uniforms, and it's not meant to glorify that. It's just because it's cosplay, basically.
And I think one thing that it comes in handy as a shorthand for that sort of political environment structure, the strictness, not necessarily references to that period in history specifically.
Well, and it's kind of like how we have a lot of action movies where the enemies are Nazis that are more or less cartoon, video game bad guys. They're just there to be mowed down and to be villainous. We're not really making a commentary on the Holocaust, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the complexity there.
What about epics? Long spanning epics. Beowulf or no.
Well, Master Chief brings up Legend of the Galactic Heroes. That's definitely one of these long running things where they got dozens of episodes, all OVA. There was no TV series of this.
All
but
OVA.
Yeah, and there are
long running OVA
something
series.
Like 100 episodes.
My goodness,
series. It's crazy.
That's long running.
Dozens and dozens, certainly.
And it's not a series.
Yeah. They just kept on producing episodes OVA. Big long thing. And partly because I was adapting novels which they could adapt. And then I think they started working with the author to write the new episodes of the OVA. I'm not sure on that.
Wow, I'd almost qualify that as a series,
Oh,
even
yeah,
though
certainly.
it's
Certainly.
OVA and separate,
Yeah.
as a long running series, because I mean,
doesn't matter if it's on TV or not, it's still long running, definitely. And that would get into things like franchises. You know, the Tenchi franchise is not really a long running story, but they did have many different stories kind of going on with the same characters, more or less.
Now, you mentioned something probably months ago that having several different franchises, manga and anime and light novels with the same group, the audience is allowed a little bit of flexibility where it doesn't have to be continuous throughout every part of the franchise, every part of the universe. They can go off on tangents, have different storylines, and they don't worry as much about the fanboys saying, hey, you said this, but it can't be because of that. In episode issue number 32, it says this. And so there's not that need for continuity. Do you think that lends towards a longer running series and the success of it if they do allow that flexibility? And to what degree do you think would
That's a great question and a great point. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that does lend itself to a long running series because you can, on the one hand, move off to a different medium and kind of mine that medium for a while and let people enjoy that, even if one other medium is kind of gone fallow for a while. Tenchi is a good example of that, where they did OVAs and TV series and movies. And then they moved off from that, but then they did some novels here and there and some radio dramas and kind of kept it going alive in other ways.
Radio dramas.
Oh, great stuff. So that is one way of handling it, that you can kind of move along. You see that a good example is Minoga Magica, where they have, they did the anime TV series, and that was original. And then they started doing manga and other adaptations, which take the story in different directions. And lets you explore that world and that concept in different ways that is more appropriate to each of those mediums. Now, I think you're right. It is a very important element of all this that anime has been able to mine very, very well. And you can contrast that with big long franchises over here, like say G.I. Joe, Star Wars, where you have lots of material, no question, lots of material. And because the Star Wars novels, for example, they can go off in their own direction, tell their own story. The movies don't necessarily have to follow it. In fact, they don't. And so that's okay. The novels can kind of exist in their own little world. George Lucas has always been very smart about that, of saying, we need to allow things kind of sit as they are and be as hands-off as possible. Both in terms of fan material and also in terms of other, official products. You can be I remember there's an author, Diane Duane, I think, who does a lot of novelizations of sci-fi franchises. So she has Star Trek novels, Star Wars novels, and she said she always liked doing Star Wars novels more than Star Trek novels, because it's in Star Wars novels the characters can end the book a little different than they started. Right? So you can actually change the characters. In Star Trek, Kirk is always Kirk. Picard is always Picard, right?
Less flexibility.
Exactly. And that is one of those things where you've got to, understand how you're dealing with those things.
Well, you got me thinking about something now, and I'm trying to formulate the thought.
Liquidus in the chat room points out long-running things like the Marvel Universe, 007, and Godzilla being good examples outside of the anime universe. But in terms of long-running film series in anime, I can't think of any, because films don't sell well in Japan. Ever since the 60s, get this, the average person in Japan goes to the cinema between 2 and 3 times a year.
That's
Period.
Not a whole lot.
Right, not a whole lot when you consider that's all films, including Hollywood films, domestic films, and anime films.
Wow.
So you're going to get very few people going out to watch those anime films.
I wonder why that is.
It's been a feature of it's starting to recover a bit. The trend is going upwards since the late 90s, I think. But Japan has always not gone. Japanese people have generally not gone out to theaters, and no one quite knows why, because it was a huge thing in the early 20th century. They had one of the biggest film industries in the world, and after World War II, it just shrank.
Mm-hmm.
It's very strange, and particularly strange because it doesn't require space at home, right? It's not like building a video collection at home. You're going out to this thing.
Yeah, very space efficient.
Exactly.
Somebody else has the film, the seats, the popcorn, and everything.
Right. So it's odd that never really came together, and it's why we have so relatively few anime films, because there's just not a big market for it.
It seems like they're making up in the quantity of anime that is lacking in the amount of film. I'm just amazed at all the titles. What about fan fiction? Does fan fiction have any impact on a longer running series?
An interesting question. I don't know if that's even an answerable question, because it gets into, how much they're actually paying attention to it.
Who knows how measurable that is?
Right. I mean, certainly we see a lot of fan fiction for those long running series, fan fiction of every stripe. And and that does, and doujinshi, of course, is a version of fan fiction. And I think that certainly is an indicator. And it lets the industry and the staff know that show is the folks are responding to that show. I don't think I haven't seen signs that the industry folds those back into the show. I don't think they're saying, oh, that character has a bunch of doujinshi, so we're going to feature her more. As far as I can tell, and I've seen so far, but that might be different and might be changing
when some of the mangaka go to Comiket or
exactly. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's one of the weird things, if you will, is that is a much more open market in every sense in Japan, where the creators can actually go to Comiket and just walk the floor and see, okay,
I like what you did with my character, or
exactly.
I can't believe they did that.
Right,
oh my.
Exactly. And let's bring up the Lucky Star example, where this kind of came to a head, and people were kind of surprised, because in Lucky Star, the characters go to Comiket, and one of the characters who hasn't been to Comiket before sees on the things a bunch of Full Metal Panic doujinshi, and picks it up, and it's been established in the show that she reads the Full Metal Panic novels. So she picks up these things and starts reading them, and realizing these are, well, you see two hunky shirtless men on the cover, crisscrossed with chains. It's hilarious. So she reads up and she immediately starts to flush red. And the person at the thing is like, you want to buy it? And she said, too hot for me. And she puts it down and walks off. Well, here's the thing. That episode is written by the original writer of Full Metal Panic. Yeah. So he's acknowledging that he knows these things are out there. He's completely aware of all of this doujinshi and stuff about his characters and that, and he put it directly in a show.
That is cool.
So that is very cool, and it shows that the industry is willing to acknowledge the fact that that's out there, and the creators are aware of it, and they're, okay with it is a strong word, but they're not stepping in to stop it. So certainly that is a factor. And an issue on there. Yeah, definitely Yaoi Doujinshi that she was picking up. It's awesome. I think it was something in Chains was the title of the manga. That's hilarious. Well, and doubly hilarious because somebody at Kyoto Animation had to draw that cover right for the for Lucky Star and put official, it in there.
Okay, who gets to do this one?
It's really hilarious. But yeah, so I think there are certainly a lot of elements to these long-running series that make them work, well.
Do particular animators or directors have an impact on the longevity? And as sometimes we'll see people come and go with a franchise or certain sections. Do those things really impact the series?
I think it does. I would argue at least as much for animators as for directors, because we saw this with Naruto, where they hired Norio Matsumoto, who was famous for doing very three-dimensional animation, and so they hired him for these fights in Naruto, where you have multiple characters all grabbing each other and throwing them around, and
choreographed just
it was a
smooth.
It was a noted thing in kind of anime fandom at the time that Norio Matsumoto was going to be working on Naruto. It showed kind of a commitment to the right kind of action for the show. And I see less of that for directors. It's certainly there, but I think, you know, trying to assemble the right staff of animators for the show is more important in the long run, because that's going to get across. I mean, One Piece has this very over the top animation, right? It's almost Looney Tunes in how the characters move and squash and stretch, besides just Luffy. And then, you know, you have shows like, again, Dragon Ball Z, which is much more grimy, gritty. It's more characters getting beat up and thrown around and pushed and being very determined. And so, you know, they're not being flattened. They're not being, you know, there's not huge clouds of smoke in the same way that you have it in One Piece. And this kind of high drama of the art. It's more the high drama of this character, you know, pushing through it. So I think that is more of an impact than other things.
How about things like color palette? Now, recently we looked at suddenly my brain escapes me. Boogie Pop.
Yeah.
Now, Boogie Pop had a very particular color palette, and adapted from something longer, but the anime series was relatively short in terms of anime series. Does a particular color palette lend itself more towards a longer running series? Because Boogie Pop, obviously, you know, that was a very niche sort of thing, but being that experimental in the way things go, seems like it didn't pan out in the long run. Do you find any trends with long running series?
That's a great point, and I think you're absolutely right that shonen, long running anime series tend to have a very standard anime, more or less cartoony color palette, in the sense that it is a bright, varied color palette, right? So look at Fairy Tail, look at Dragon Ball Z. You have generally vibrant colors and a wide variety of colors. Think of Haibane Renmei, very subdued color palette. Other shows, very subdued color palette. One of the reasons for that is when you're animating something over the course of hundreds of episodes, you have lots of different studios working on different episodes. You have lots of different animators working on different episodes. The more you have to tell them, don't use these colors.
Color match this, and this.
Yeah.
Gradients and blending and oh my.
Right. Yeah. So you get much simpler stuff, if you will, in shonen for exactly that reason. And so yeah, I think that's a very important point, that you can't get too artsy fartsy in a long running series, because it gets a lot. It
just won't look consistently enough uniform.
And
it was orange here, he's red here. What happened?
In fact, Rurouni Kenshin is a good example of that, where the art style of that shifts quite dramatically over the course of the show, where you'll see some shots where the characters are darker than others, and where the tints are just very different, because, you know, Studio A worked on that one, Studio B worked on that one. They just had to get it done. So yeah, and that is a show that's trying to be more realistic in its visuals, if you will. It's set in a very specific time in Japanese history. So that becomes more complicated because you have a more subdued color palette. You don't have kind of the wild stuff, wild hair colors and such that you get in other anime series.
Would that apply as well, you think, to the detail in the drawing? And now manga, they go into a more specific detail because they can, and it's still framed, but with animation, they're generally less detailed. Do you think the trends are similar with long running series having a more or less detail lends to letting the series go longer?
No question, although that is one of those more budgetary questions where, you know, you'll even see shorter series of very simple character design because they don't have money either. You know, so they're just not going to spend money on it. I'd say that's more an issue for any show to deal with, but it's particularly important for a long-running series to nail that down and figure out, okay, if it's this complicated, are we going to be able to sustain that over the course of a long-running series? There's one show, I'm trying to remember the name of it, where they specifically said that was an issue with one of the characters, where they were just so complicated to draw, it was a problem. Well, and certainly, going a bit off target, Turn A Gundam. had this issue. So if you look at Turn A Gundam and Google that and look at the mecha designs in Turn A Gundam, you notice they're very rounded, they're very spherical, or they're very distinctive. You have these things that just don't look like your typical, mecha
I want to see
anime. And
there's
some of the Turn A itself, and you see it has this interesting, very unusual style to it. It's got a lot of curves to it you don't see in a typical Gundam series. And there's the Turn X, which has this rather odd visual style to it.
Less angular, sharp angle, more aerodynamic, I guess.
Because those were all designed by Sid Mead, the designer who did Blade Runner and Alien and lots of other things. And he had this kind of flowing approach to him. These were a lot harder to draw, because you imagine with a typical Gundam, you have these more straight lines. With this, okay, exactly how far away is that chest plate from the shoulder, right? And if he moves this shoulder, exactly what does that do to that shape to make it look right? So it's actually a lot harder to draw these than they were for typical mecha design. And Tomino, the director, said, I'm not complaining about the character designs. He said, I'm very glad Sid Mead drew them, but as it turned out, the effect was it was harder and it took longer and it's more expensive to draw because they were so distinctive and unusual. So that's definitely something you have to think about. You look at the characters in Dragon Ball Z, and if we can get past some of these, there's yes, there's detail there, but you have very simple colors, very simple shapes to things, relatively speaking. Goku's hair is black. There are no highlights. There's
not
nothing.
Sunlight making some bright, some dark. It's black.
Yeah. And obviously there's some variations here and there.
But it's not going to be a whole gradient. It's going to be stepped so you can see the general gist of it.
Totally. So you have to be much more careful about that. And it's one of the reasons why he doesn't go Super Saiyan all that often. It's a very careful thing. So these are all things you think about in terms of your character designs and how to make them more effective. Is that a decently good? Well, we'll zoom in a little bit on it.
More details.
Yeah. So you see here again, all these characters, bald with antennae, black hair, jumpsuit. So you have these much simpler characters to draw than you would have in a let's say indeed your typical romance series, where you have a school outfit which has the collar and the bow, or the kerchief and the ruffles on the skirt, all that kind of stuff. You're not going to see that as much in long running series because it's just a pain in the neck to draw.
Animating that. I mean, if the wind blows, you have to have all sorts of motion. Oh my. Well, that makes me think that technology may have some impact, and the idea that a Gundam could now be designed with AutoCAD and then scaled and kept consistent by just rotating and scaling things.
And we're certainly seeing that in mecha series in general, where the mecha are increasingly done in CGI. It's one of the reasons to do that is it makes it easier, less expensive in the long run to make those shows and those designs, because you don't get trapped by those issues. The issue now is making that look like anime, and not stick out and look strange.
Yeah, so. It does have a different feel when you see it. I wonder if they'll be able to overcome that.
Yeah, well, they're getting close. I watched Expelled from Paradise this week, and dang, if anime looks like that in CGI, I'm all for it. I mean, that is just, and I'll show you some stuff here. The girl's outfit is a little absurd, but that is kind of the nature of anime, right?
Gotta be, otherwise it'd be normal life.
Pretty much. Yeah, this is CGI.
Wow.
And they really managed to make these characters, look like anime characters. There's really very little about these characters that don't that I don't have any problems with them. They move very well. They did a great job with the animation, where it doesn't look weird and plasticky. It has that economy of motion you get in anime, but it doesn't feel cheap. It's more bold movement than anything else. So it's getting there. We're it may happen, but again, this is a film, so they had a lot more budget, a lot more time to make it look right, compared to your average TV show, which has a new episode every week.
Weight-wise, as far as value, what would you say are the top 5 characteristics probably that would be the things that really carry a series on to franchise and long-running, and of course OVAs, fan fiction, merchandise, all that stuff?
Certainly characters. So a good variety of interesting characters. Setting. So a flexible setting, more specifically. The premise and the plot, like you were saying, treading a middle ground between having a very clear sort of direction and not getting repetitive. What are the other two? I'll give you the other two.
Having characters that you can listen to, I think helps. There have been a few characters that I'm not sure how, at least in the English dub, the characters were too annoying.
Okay.
To listen to.
Okay.
For whatever reason, whether it was directing or the quality of the voice. I found.
I've heard with a few Japanese dubs recently, actually.
So I think sound can have a big impact.
Sure.
And having underscoring or the music underneath, good Foley effects, all lends to it. It doesn't necessarily pop in your consciousness,
right,
if it's done well, but it's there and you can feel it. And next thing you know, you're emotionally wrapped up and you're going, oh yeah, there is music on that. But if it's done poorly, then I feel kind of manipulated. I'm like, no. But well done, I'd say. Music to me has an impact, because there's all sorts of natural sounds, the bus going by, the June bugs, right timing, I think, for those kind of things, as well as the voice. Choosing the voices, right? So I would say two things: casting good voices for that, and also the other sound effects. So I guess I'm leaning heavy to the sound rather than the visual for the last two.
Fair enough. Cool. All right, we've been going for well over an hour now. So thank you all very much in the chat room for your comments and suggestions. Appreciate you guys giving us thoughts and so forth. And you're right. CGI is definitely moving along and getting better.
It sounds so good.
It's interesting. I have, so before we leave, quick mini review of Expelled from Paradise. Might as well leave you a little something there. It's action movie, sort of a buddy cop movie. Without getting into spoilers, girl from a sort of digitized digital paradise accepts a job, and she has to go into the real world and team up with a native of the real world, if you will, and go off on this mission. So girl and guy, and you have the kind of the classic buddy cop thing, they're kind of mismatched, but they work reasonably well together, but they're arguing the whole time. That kind of concept. The interesting thing here is you get, so for you anime fans, the girl here is, I'm going to get her name wrong. Let me not get her name wrong. Whoops. Sorry, guys. So the guy is played by Lockon Stratos from Gundam 00, his voice actor. So if you've seen that show, and he's a sniper in this too, which is kind of awesome and that makes sense. But the girl is played by none other than Rie Kugumiya, who is known as the Queen of Tsundere in anime. So she was Taiga in Toradora, Louise in The Familiar of Zero, and lots of Tsundere over time. So she plays this very Tsundere character. She was Al in Full Metal Alchemist, Happy in Fairy Tail, Kagura and Gintama, Naga, and Haide the Combat Butler. Wow. And she was also actually in Gundam 00 as Nina Trinity, who is also a very Tsundere character. And then the The other main male character, or male-ish character, was also in Gundam 00. So it's kind of a 00 reunion because it was directed by the same director as Gundam 00, which is kind of fun. In the English dub, these voice actors just happened to be Steve Bloom and Wendy Lee.
What a combo! That's a great combo there.
And the other male character is Johnny Young Bosch, namely Vash the Stampede. Nice. So neat sort of because you have sort of Spike and Faye back together again in kind of a sort of a way.
That sounds like a good team.
It's a really fun actiony movie. I will say it did leave a bad taste in my mouth.
Did it?
And she was Shauna as well. Rie was also a Shauna.
And why? How did it leave a bad taste? Was it a plot or story or what aspect?
The female character is constantly undercut by the male character.
That could be frustrating.
So she's established as the protagonist. She's established as being awesome, but the male character is consistently kind of putting her in her place, making her do things without asking her first. And there's this kind of paternalistic feel to the whole thing.
Almost a puppet.
Right, exactly. And so she's constantly having to be put in her place by this guy.
Is it acknowledged as being such, or is it just sort of taken as granted?
Just taken for granted.
Oh, basically. Yeah, that's a little frustrating. Because if you acknowledge it, then you're making a point of it.
Right now,
if it's being accepted that way, then it's
and worse, like the only time she's allowed to be awesome is when she's either doing a job for the guy that he tricked her into doing, or she's beating up other female characters. And it's just like it just left.
You like to have more depth to a character,
exactly. And it was just
their own thoughts, their own volition, their own.
In fairness, like he's not haughty about it. He's not treating her like a little kid all the time. But there is very much this kind of paternalistic attitude to it. Which is a shame because the script's by Gen Urobuchi, who wrote Madoka Magica and Fate Zero, and a bunch of other stuff, Black Lagoon. Very well respected author, Psychopaths, but just it's one of those things where just the female character cannot have agency. She cannot get things done on her own. It's the guys who are the only ones who are allowed to get things done. It's one of those things where, again, it didn't ruin the film for me.
But it is one of those things that kind of sticks in the...
Yeah. It's just like, did you really have to do that to her? She's an awesome character. She's a really fun character to watch. And it felt like a waste of her character to have her, subordinated.
It would really be neat to have some authors take that and run with it and develop it as a somebody's coming out of hey, hold on, let me make these decisions, what are you doing there, and kind of confront the issue. But I'm not sure how much of the culture would find that confrontational or not.
I don't know. And again,
in the US it's definitely something that we accept. I'm not sure Japanese culture how deep that would be.
I mean, I have no idea how. I'm not trying to comment here on Japanese society in general,
but this storyline,
this storyline specifically just felt,
and that may not even be with the same author for everything.
Sure, certainly not.
It's a particular character trait, just that character trait.
Yeah, it was very evident in that, which is one of the things. Was again unfortunate in a movie that didn't have to be that way. Yeah, but such is life.
I think somebody had asked us a question up here that. Let's see.
It's a little hard for us to scroll up in the chat room here. Let's see. Yes, I have seen Key the Metal Idol, but I don't quite see how that's relevant to.
I'm not sure what would this show,
because it's not long running, and it does not have a tsundere character, really. Kind of, but not really. But it is kind of an. I was very impressed with Key the Metal Idol. I'll put it that way.
I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
What's the storyline on that?
We got to go here, but
it is getting.
We'll just say, Key is an android. Like, she believes she's an android. No one else believes she is.
Oh.
Who is in the middle of a mystery, in the center of a mystery. and people are trying to figure out what's going on in a world where androids are becoming increasing, well, where it is possible for there to be androids, but no one seems to have quite cracked it yet. But she might be the key.
She might be the key. So what should we think about for next time around?
Well, we're not going to be here for a little while.
Oh.
We have a few other events coming up. So we may or may not be back here in following weeks. Can't promise anything.
But for everybody who joined us last Friday and Saturday,
thank you very much
for our special event,
thank you.
On-site location, reporting from.
We were at Anamore
in Baltimore.
Exactly.
So
it was a good time. So we will be back in 3 weeks, hopefully, with a regularly scheduled brain swap to talk about the question of whether you should buy anime on disc or not. Meaning, people have been arguing a lot over the ethics and morality of buying anime and how important it is to buy anime. And so we're going to ask, and sort of in contrast to the earlier question about, are fan subs, morally wrong, if you will, we're going to ask, is it morally right to buy discs, to buy anime? Where does the line fall?
That sounds like it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Hopefully you'll join us and give us some feedback on your perspective.
Absolutely. So thank you all very much. Take care. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.